Hello and welcome to this first preliminary report of the Global Pound Conference series. My name is Jeremy Lack, and I had the great pleasure of acting as the coordinator to the series from 2016 to 2017. What we'd like to do is share with you today the results of this report, which only came out a few days ago on May 16th, which we believe shows a lot of interesting new information about how we could think about the future of justice and how to possibly improve it in the 21st century, especially looking at it from the perspective of commercial disputes and looking at it domestically as well as globally at the same time. Very briefly, this report is submitted to the same open licensing rules. We ask that all data or articles about the GPC series be provided back to us online so we can share with the global community people's thoughts and reactions to this. The GPC was an unprecedented experiment. It was 28 cities in 24 countries. We also had approximately 700 people participate online through surveys, and all in all, we had over 4,400 participants from around the world. And we believe this is a unique collection of data involving all stakeholders involved in commercial dispute resolution. I would also like to thank our sponsors now who made all of this possible. This was a very big and unprecedented project, as I said earlier, and without our sponsors, this would not have been possible. So thank you to all of you. A few quick words about the delegates to give you a sense of who was there. We had highly experienced delegates attending from around the world. As you can see, many of them had over 500 cases of experience, and we only had around 25% who had less than 10 cases of experience. So that really shows a lot of knowledge in the room, or in the collective rooms around the world. Secondly, people came from a wide range of ADR practices, 25% only litigation, 28% only mediation, 12% only arbitration, 3% only conciliation, and the rest of them being a mix of processes in the system. We also had a big balance of practitioners. Many were focused on domestic work, the majority, but we did have a robust amount of people doing either cross-border work or international work in many different countries. And also, in terms of the size of the companies, we really had most people coming from small and medium-sized enterprises, although we obviously did also get large multinationals as well in the process. But what's important here is to remember, as you look at the data, that this is not just the results from very large corporations, but also a majority of these companies have less than 500 people in them. So moving on, and the other thing is gender parity. Yes, we think it's roughly parity, but some people may disagree, and there might be room to improve on this so that it's more of a 50-50 balance in the future. In terms of average attendance, the problem with the GPC series was that there was a full day event. So it is natural that throughout the day, as people moved from session 1 to session 2 to session 3 to session 4, the number of people dropped. And you will see that reflected in the chart below. The main thing is, though, we were able to track 5 different stakeholder groups at the same time: how parties were voting, how their advisors were voting, how adjudicative providers, meaning judges and arbitrators, were voting, how non-adjudicative providers, which means mediators and conciliators, were voting, and finally how miscellaneous influencers were voting, be they academic, government official, think tank, specialists, etc. And what we see on average, though, is a fairly consistent and statistically reliable number of votes per session, approximately 2,390 people in each session on average. And as you can see, the smallest group was the parties, 345 people, which is still 15% and highly representative, and the largest group being mediators and advisors, or I should say non-adjudicative providers and advisors. So that is it in terms of the demographics and how the votes were counted. So let's turn to this preliminary report issued by Herbert Smith Freehills, PwC, and IMI that came out just a few days ago. And we invite you to read the entire report, articles about it, and to join a conversation about this online. And we'll get to that on our final page. The most important, though, key findings are what are found in this key report. And please remember, these are only the results of the multiple choice votes that were voted upon throughout all the conferences. So for those of you who did not attend a GPC event, the day was, or it was a full day event typically, with some exceptions. There were 20 multiple choice questions asked throughout 4 sessions, but there were also open text questions and delegate information and word clouds and many other things. That is not so much the focus of the preliminary report, and we are still working with the academic committee with the help of Resolution Resources in Australia to be able to do a full detailed analysis of the data. Such has already been done just for the opening Singapore event, and we invite you to look at the Singapore full report to see kind of what a full report might look like once we're able to complete this. If you're interested in contributing or becoming involved in the final report, which includes looking at the deeper data, please feel free to contact us. We would be delighted to have you involved and have your support. But moving on to the key findings of the preliminary report, I'll throw in a thank you at this stage to all the staff at Herbert Smith Freehills and at PwC, without whom this preliminary report would not have been possible. Here are the overall findings. So first of all, there are 4 key global themes that seem to appear across the world. The first one is a greater need for efficiency. The second one is a greater desire for collaboration. The third one is, and I'll use my own formulation on this, a greater desire for more informed choices, be it in pre-dispute clauses or once a dispute has started, the ability to mix different types of dispute resolution without having to choose between adjudicative or non-adjudicative, but looking at ways to combine adjudicative and non-adjudicative processes. And finally, the fourth trend is how familiarity and the notion of familiarity is affecting how the landscape of dispute resolution is changing, which includes a much greater potential role for in-house counsel, it seems, with everybody, external counsel as well, seeing themselves as a potential barrier to change. And that it shows a lot of self-reflection as well, which we'll get onto in a moment. But these are the main 4 themes, and again, these are dealt with in more detail in the report itself. Let me go to each of these themes in turn one by one at this stage. So the first theme is that of efficiency. And it seems that at least parties clearly are prioritizing efficiency over predictability or enforceability of outcomes. Now, this clearly will depend on the type of party. Very often inexperienced parties or highly emotional parties will want their sense of justice. It's maybe perhaps the more experienced people who've been involved in several disputes who at a time step back and start thinking, well, how cost effective, how time effective, how much is this going to cost me in terms of resources, how is this going to affect my business in other ways? These are the notions of efficiency that are coming up as people look at this more. But it's no longer just the advice from lawyers or in-house counsel that matters. It's really now, it seems to be almost an analysis of what are the key factors that are going to be able to be taken into consideration for looking at the efficiency of the outcome versus the correctness possibly of the outcome. And so the results show clearly that efficiency is a #1 priority for parties, followed by advice, followed by the predictability of the outcomes that people could expect. The second theme was that of collaboration. And what we see, again, globally, is that parties really want to see more collaborative behavior when a dispute happens, and also on behalf of their lawyers. Now, what's interesting for this, and a slight discrepancy, is that lawyers or advisors, as I should say, when they vote on this, tend to see their role primarily as being advocates. And that is assuming traditional advocacy, meaning to argue the case and argue the positions. And so there are a couple of questions for this. Is this a matter of US influence? As you'll see later on, no. and I shouldn't single out the US maybe, but there is a question about North America that we'll see at the end of this presentation. But what this does highlight in any event is that the question of how collaborative lawyers should be is maybe something they should be discussing beforehand with their clients. How robust, how strong an advocate should you be in a meeting might not be the same type of thing as the type of advocacy you want before an arbitrator, a judge, or a mediator. And perhaps gauging these things, understanding them, is something that could be discussed more clearly before moving into proceedings. The other question is identifying what are the key issues and what are the core metrics that will be used to understand what is efficiency in this context, and also how people will judge what is deemed and perceived to be collaborative behavior. So that is the second theme that you will see discussed in the preliminary report. The third theme is what I perceive as a matter of informed choice. It is clear that there's a greater interest in preventative protocols, a greater understanding of what can be put in contracts and pre-dispute clauses to help understand propensity to escalate, and how different types of processes, escalating clauses, for example, can be used where parties might move from negotiation to maybe mediation to maybe arbitration or litigation. But that's something that clearly people want to be looking at and thinking of all the work that can be done preventively and upfront. And that's not only the clauses, it's possibly even looking at the mechanisms for negotiations and how they happen. But the second most popular choice in terms of what should be prioritized seems to be combining processes. And that was a big surprise of the Global Pound Conference. There was a sense that maybe there would be a tendency to vote more for existing adjudicative processes. And oddly enough, that came, as you will see, the last of the bunch. Adjudicative resolution methods came in very far and final place with only 10% popularity ranking. So it means that there's a big gap between what the market is currently offering primarily, which is adjudicative resolution methods, and what everybody thinks should be prioritized, which is other things. So as you can see, the top three choices after preventive action were combining process, non-adjudicative processes, and finally just looking at how to reduce reduction of time and or cost, and a greater emphasis on looking how to use technology as well more effectively. When we look at the results also from the rough data from the multiple choice, there is an interesting correlator of that in session 1, question 4. The question there was, when parties start a dispute, where do they want to normally start? What type of process do they want? Do the parties want to retain control over the process and the outcome? Do they only want to retain control over the outcome but not the process, or the process but not the outcome? Or finally, would they prefer maybe the providers to decide both process issues and outcome? And it seems very clear from the overall data that the parties just don't know about this, or don't think about this much, and don't have much of a discussion about it. So a guided discussion in the beginning explaining their choice and informing them of their choice seems to be a universal recommendation across all categories, whether it was lawyers or judges or arbitrators, mediators, and so on. But more interestingly is, after that has been done, there were some discrepancies about who should stay in control of process and outcome. It seems to be that there is a slight preference that providers should, kind of make a determination on what's the best process, and the parties would then decide what the outcome should be once they know what the processes have been recommended or set for them. But it looks as though when you look at the data broken up, as you'll see over here, that really parties and their advisors, lawyers, and judges and mediators thought that really parties should decide everything. It's very strange in this result that actually mediators and conciliators really put that down as a very low choice, thinking that providers should decide everything as an alternative. In any event, all this does is simply add to the discussion and I think enhance the analysis that the preliminary report contains regarding choice and the idea of being able to have more information about what the options are and not having to think about either or but and how to mix modes. This goes on to the next global theme, which is that of familiarity. the question of familiarity is one that really influences the perceptions of in-house counsel and external counsel and the roles they can have. So the question that was asked for the answers you're seeing here is that when lawyers, whether internal or external, make recommendations, what has the most influence? And what clearly came out was that familiarity came out first. It wasn't even the type of outcome required by the parties, and it wasn't the cost even or how much people could bill, although that was an important issue. It was really saying it's familiarity that matters most. And we need, I think, to make a distinction between familiarity and education. Interestingly enough, lawyers' advisors did rank that the type of outcome desired by their clients was the most important. So we should clearly bear that in mind. But they did really almost put that equally. The 57% ranking compared to 55% popularity ranking of familiarity really shows that familiarity, even for lawyers themselves, is a huge issue. So again, this is not about education, this is not about training, it's really feeling equally comfortable in adjudicative and non-adjudicative processes. As long as advisors are not equally comfortable in both roles, it looks as though the recommendations will be influenced by whatever they feel most comfortable doing. And that's something that the report suggests should be addressed and in a different way, possibly, for example, by having more trainings with role plays that would allow young lawyers to really feel equally comfortable as adjudicators or in adjudicative proceedings as well as non-adjudicative proceedings, and not just the theory but in practice. The next global theme was the role of in-house counsel, which is a corollary to that, because it seems that in-house counsel are recognized globally as the agents who can most facilitate organizational change. And so the question was, for question 3.5 of the GPC series, which stakeholders have the potential to be most influential in bringing about change? And in-house lawyers came in first with a 42% ranking, just ahead of governments and ministries, followed by adjudicative providers, meaning judges or arbitrators themselves. And these are not typically the people that we might think about. Interestingly, when you look at the cross-sorted results, as you see over here, every stakeholder group thought they were the most important influential people. So parties thought themselves, or their in-house counsel advisors thought external lawyers were the most important, adjudicative providers thought they were the most important, the non-adjudicative community thought it's up to government and ministries, and so did the academics. But other than that, it's an interesting trend to see kind of where there's a mismatch in a way between where parties think in-house counsel should rank and where the rest of the stakeholder community ranked in-house counsel, which was actually quite low, which is what brought that, that average down a bit. In the meantime, that's as we think about in-house counsel and the role of in-house counsel, what was equally surprising was how tough everybody was on external lawyers. External lawyers were deemed to be the most resistant and greatest obstacles to change. And here's a quote from the report: the 21st century dispute resolution lawyer needs to deliver or to work with others to deliver what parties want, which is dispute resolution process design, collaboration to pursue efficient outcomes, as well as traditional tough representation, but only when called for. So external lawyers were seen as the most resistant to change, and by lawyers themselves. So when you look at the cross-sorted results and you look at the light blue line across the top here, even external lawyers ranked themselves with the 62 popularity ranking as the most likely obstacles to change, which shows at least there's self-recognition and need for change from that level. Having looked at the global change, let's maybe now look at some of the regional differences that we came across. So first of all, to understand the regions as we broke them down, there's North America, which was USA and Canada, Asia, which was Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, and India, UK, special jurisdiction, that's a whole question in itself that we'll come back to, Oceania, which was Australia and New Zealand, continental Europe, or France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Amsterdam, Poland, Spain, and Switzerland, Spain having events both in Barcelona and in Madrid. Africa, Middle East was the next zone. That was Nigeria, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates. And finally, we had Latin America, which was Brazil, Sao Paulo, which most of you are at today, so hello to everybody, Guatemala, Guatemala City, and Mexico. And so that's how the data were regrouped, and that showed that, first of all, some strong trends, which I'll cover one by one. Overall, though, greater desire for regulation, especially in Asia, efficiency. Actually, that same trend, with the exception of Asia, however. Continental Europe seems to have some differences, also similarities with Latin America, for those of you in Sao Paulo today watching. And we do come back to this question about the UK. Is there something different there from the rest of the world? And you can make your own views on this once you'll see the data later on. In terms of regional differences, the first one was regulation. And it seems that there is at least a desired regulation very strongly in Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. And it might be perhaps a different stage of development or history of development of dispute resolution in these different areas, although in some ways both Latin America has a lot of advance on ADR in some countries, and that's certainly also true for Asia if you're looking at Hong Kong, Singapore, and new changes that are happening in China. In any event, the question was, which of the following areas would most improve commercial dispute resolution? And while Oceania, Continental Europe, North America, UK all voted quite clearly that use of protocols promoting more ADR processes before adjudicative processes would be, the thing that would be most helpful to improve dispute resolution, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America really were pushing more for regulatory legislation conventions. Sometimes in some countries, the discussion was even being compulsory use of non-adjudicative processes before adjudicative ones. So not protocols, but actually regulations imposing this. The second regional difference was, again, looking at efficiency, which we talked about earlier. Was interesting, though, to see how Asia had a different view of this. In Asia, quite clearly, the demand for certainty and enforceability of outcomes outweighed the desire for greater efficiency. And that really was something that did seem to distinguish the votes that were coming from Asia. Then we come to the third group of regional differences, which is really continental Europe, which actually requires 3 slides to describe. And again, what's interesting is the similarities between Latin America as a civil law jurisdiction with continental Europe for some of this, or even Europe as a whole, which would include UK. Because we don't have data from Ireland, very difficult to know really how much of this is common law versus civil law. It's a pity, and maybe that's a future thing that could be done. In the meantime, the question was, who's primarily responsible for ensuring parties involved in commercial disputes understand the process options? And with the exception of continental Europe and Latin America, the rest of the world said external lawyers. UK is special because it actually put the two equal at exactly 69%. In all the other countries, there was a notable difference, with a large difference in Europe that seemed to think in-house lawyers are far more responsible from external lawyers. And you saw the parties vote on that as well. But it doesn't mean that the parties were mainly in Europe. Parties were really around the world. So we've got to understand that Europe maybe is more in sync from that point of view with where parties want to see change, which we'll discuss later at the end of this presentation. The second regional difference linked to continental Europe is whether or not there's sufficient knowledge about what the options are. And interestingly, continental Europe said it's really insufficient knowledge about the options that's the greatest obstacle, and that need to be changed. It wasn't even financial or time constraints, which was clearly a problem for almost all the rest of the world. Latin America, again, very similar to continental Europe in saying it's the lack of understanding of the options that was the problem, more so than cost or time constraints. So that's an interesting thing to look at, which suggests that perhaps more emphasis is needed on education, as well as that notion of familiarity for everybody, at least in continental Europe and in Latin America, although that, again, seems to be a global issue and a global need for greater familiarity, because familiarity seems to be influencing what the recommendations were, at least by advisors. The third issue that comes up, the third regional difference that comes up linked to continental Europe, is that of corporate attitudes. And it seemed to be that whereas all the rest of the world was really saying that there's a need for this greater emphasis on collaborative instead of adversarial processes, continental Europe seemed to say, no, that's not so true. We really need to have a change in corporate attitude to conflict prevention in general. So a more upstream approach to this. And this suggests this is not just a civil law versus common law issue, or because Latin America and also some African countries, but actually not in this case. But civil law, the civil law divide was broken on this, and Latin America clearly also voted that there should be this greater emphasis on collaborative instead of adversarial process that matters. Whereas for continental Europe, it was really this first of all, you need to look at corporations and how, and maybe this touches on the role of in-house counsel in civil law corporations. Definitely the deep data that we'll look at might help to analyze and understand better this trend that we're seeing. So in any event, Latin America was different from Europe on this point, which is that corporate attitudes really need to be changing, it seems, in continental Europe, according to the voters there. Finally, there was this question, is the UK different? Now, the preliminary report suggests that yes, in some ways, and that this is probably a consequence of the Woolf reforms that were done by Lord Woolf in 1997, that now there have been basically 20 years later, a whole new generation of lawyers living with the changes that Lord Woolf brought, which is including bringing in ADR into that jurisdiction. So when you looked at the recommendation, what most influenced lawyers, what our colleagues at PwC and Herbert Smith Freehills picked up was that UK was the only jurisdiction that actually put the type of outcome requested as being more important by 3 percentage points than familiarity. Is this really something true? Is it more the sophistication of the audience, possibly who attended the London event? Very difficult to generalize this. The deep data will be helpful to look at it. But what is very clear, though, still is, first of all, how important familiarity was. You can see that clear preference in all countries except for the UK, where this was either an anomaly or something different going on there, which is certainly something to be discussed. But even if it's not clear whether UK is different or not, the data does suggest that North America is different in some ways. What this is really about is the role of lawyers or the advisors. And it seems that North America really still see that the primary role for lawyers is to be advocates. Now, is this something that should be changed? Is this something to be discussed? Is this a reflection on a different common law culture? Again, it's quite different from the UK and quite strikingly different. So it doesn't seem to be a common law issue. It does seem to be more a regional cultural issue about the role of lawyers and how they work and the need maybe to work collaboratively. Possibly within the United States or across Canada, there might be differences. Certainly, ADR professionals sometimes talk about California being a bit different from the rest of the United States. The deep data, which looks at, we had 5 different cities in the USA, and we had Toronto as well. The deep data might be able to help to parse some of this information out. But it does suggest that North America, for the moment at least, might be different from this point of view and standing out on this question of collaborative behavior. This was just a very quick overview of the Global Pound Conference's initial report. I remind you again, this is just a summary and a brief summary of the multiple choice questions. We are trying to now do a full analysis of the deep data. We would definitely value and welcome your support for that work. If you have any additional questions about this or you'd like to be more involved, please contact us. All that remains for me to do is, first of all, to say thank you very much, or muito obrigado, primarily to Herbert Smith Freehills and to PwC, who are not only anchor sponsors for the GPC series, but also in writing this report. This report is really largely put together with all the painstaking efforts of their teams. So thank you very much. Thank you also to all the staff at IMI who contributed to make the GPC such a success and worked so hard to keep it together. And for us, this conversation is only beginning. The Global Pound Conference was the beginning of a series of data. We realized that all these stakeholders enjoy and need an opportunity to exchange views across stakeholder groups. So the GPC is now changing its name from Global Pound Conference to Global Pound Conversation. And we invite you to join us and to follow more discussions and events of the Global Pound conversation now, I should say, using this link that you will find on this slide. That's it for me. Thank you very much for your time and attention today, and we wish you a good conference and hope that you find this data as thought-provoking and stimulating as certainly the organizers found it to turn out to be. Goodbye and thank you.